Today we're on lesson 4, comparing functions. This is our last lesson for the week. It says I can compare different functions by analyzing the slope and y-intercept. So we're looking at two different functions either given to us by a table, a graph, or an equation, and we want to compare them. So let's take a look at number 1. Now our workspace is on the left-hand side. Okay, the problem is on the right. So it says function 1 is defined by the equation y equals negative 1/4 r minus 5. So function 1 is defined by an equation. Function 2 is defined by line P shown on the graph. Now it wants to know which function has a greater y-intercept. So y-intercept is the starting point. So let's first look at function 1. Function 1, the y-intercept, which is our b value. If you look at this, remember y equals mx plus b. My b value here is negative 5. For function 2, our b value is the starting point. So looking at your graph, it's where it hits the y-axis. It hits the y-axis between negative 6 and negative 8. The only one that's between there is negative 7. So it says which function has the greater y-intercept? Which one's bigger? Now be careful because these are negatives. We want the least negative number because that means it's the biggest. So that means it's going to be function 1 has the greater y-intercept. Okay? All right, next one, number 2. So these are spaced kind of strangely because I wanted to make sure everyone had enough space. So let's take a look at this function. So we got function 1 is defined by the table. Function 2 is defined by this line. Which function has a greater y-intercept? So again, the y-intercept is the starting point, okay? Now this table tells you the starting point, okay? The starting point is, remember, it's where I'm gonna go back up to this problem. It's where it hits the y-axis. What is the x-coordinate when it hits the y-axis right here? Okay, the x-coordinate is 0. That point right there is 0, negative 7. Okay, so we want to look for the table value where x equals 0. In this case, it's t, but that y-intercept would be negative 6.5. So for function 1, our b value is negative 6.5. Function 2, I want you to figure out on your own and then determine which one's larger. Okay, check your work with my work. These two are really close, but negative 6 is less negative than negative 6.5. So that means function 2 has the greater y-intercept. Okay, now we're going to work with some on comparing slopes. So number 3, it's the same equation, I believe, as the first one, right? Yeah. So except we're just interpreting slope. That means the rate at which it is changing. So for function 1, remember slope is the m value. It's the one that is attached to x. In this case, it is attached to r, but that's replacing x for this problem. So my slope for function 1 is negative 1/4. For function 2, now we're looking at a graph here. So we want to be careful. We want to find two distinct points along our line. I always like to pick the y-intercept, and then let's see right there. Okay, so to get from one point to the next, remember we are walking down a hill, so this is negative. So down 1 over 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So my slope for function 2 is negative 1 over 4. Now this is a trick question. It says which function has a more negative slope? Both functions have the same slope. Okay, so that's a trick question. Now it is not the same function because the y-intercept here is negative 7. The y-intercept up here is negative 5. So these lines are not the same, but they would be parallel. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the next one. Again, we're working with the table here and an equation, so we haven't seen this one yet. So function 1 is defined by the equation d equals negative 3/7 t minus 4. Function 2 is defined by the table. Which function has a more negative slope? So let's first start with function 1 because I think that's a little bit easier. Okay, the slope is always attached to that x value. In this case, it's t, so it's -3/7. For function 2, it doesn't tell us the slope right off the bat. So I have a table of points. I want to figure out what the slope is. So the way that we figure out slope from a table of points is by using our slope formula. Okay, so that's y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I'm just going to pick these first 2 points. Okay, so my y2 value is 0.8 minus y1 all over 2 minus 0. Now I decided not to do the fraction piece here, so just be careful with that. Simplify the top first. We've got 0.8 minus 2 gives us -1.2. And then 2 minus 0 is 2. Simplify that out. We get m equals -0.6. Now, if you struggle with comparing a fraction to a decimal, change one of them. So I always like to compare decimal to decimal, actually. So I'm going to change the -3/7 to a decimal just by typing in -3 divided by 7. I get -0.42857, and it keeps going forever and ever. So which one is more negative? So the bigger -1 is going to be function 2. So function 2 has a more negative slope. Okay, that's all I got for you for today. You have your evidence of learning due tomorrow, as well as any old evidences of learning that you have not turned in. Make sure you get all of your late and this week's assignments to me by tomorrow.